Okay, we are back with our online lectures. I'm still struggling to get my headset working, so I really hope that the sound is okay. I watched the videos back, and some parts were a little difficult, but I think it's still relatively clear. Let me know if you guys have issues with the recordings, and I'll be happy to, work with you to clarify anything. But let's go on and move into the next lecture right now. So I think this will be split into 3 or 4 parts as well, and we will get started. The first part being relatively, oh crap, share my screen. The first part will be relatively, what's the word, short. I suppose I have a brief intro to the lecture, and then the other few sections will be a little longer. So this week I am using The Good Place as my weekly theme. Um, the architect job is what I was thinking. So if you're not familiar with the show, the character here, Michael, is an architect of the Good Place, which is kind of like the afterlife or the heaven. And it's a really good show. So if you haven't seen it and you're bored on your couch or you're bored at home, you don't know what to do, you're looking for something to watch, I highly recommend it. Um, Very interesting, gets very philosophical at times. I'm using it to represent the lecture of stress and worker well-being because, what could possibly be more stressful than being in the good place? Haha, just kidding. Um, no, and the job of the architect of having to design the perfect or whatever location for the afterlife. But I won't be talking too in depth about the show. It just recently ended, so anyways, let's get started with our intro to stress. I think this is a great time to be talking about stress because I think everyone in the entire world is completely overwhelmed and stressed out right now trying to follow what's going on. And if you guys are anything like me, you're having trouble focusing on even the most simple of tasks because you want to check the news every 5 minutes. And I think that, especially when it comes to workplace stress, people are all over the map in terms of, those who are still able to work. A lot of them are having more stress than they've ever experienced because of everything that's going on, because of having to switch everything up. Like I had to change this whole class because the grocery workers and first responders and nurses are dealing with ridiculous amounts of stress and strain right now. And then other people are stressed because they can't work and they want to, and then they can't leave their house and they want to. So we're experiencing a lot of stress, and it's not something that is completely new to anyone. We all experience stress, but it's probably a little bit greater at this current phase than it has been in times past. And so to define stress really broadly, it's actually just defined as a pressure or a tension. So it's kind of defined more in a physical sense, this pressure or tension. But of course, we know that pressure can occur psychologically and emotionally as well. Tension, same thing. So it could be physical, but it could also be psychological or emotional. In psychology and especially in IO, we differentiate between 3 kind of elements of stress. It's not just one thing. We talk about perceived stress, stressors, and strain. And I will get to what those are differentially from each other and how they relate. There are also many different subtypes and categories within those, and I'll kind of elaborate a little bit on that as well. So experiencing stress can actually be productive or counterproductive. So we typically think of stress as something that is counterproductive. We think of it as a negative, as a bad thing, a problem, something we don't want. However, um, in science, we differentiate between eustress and distress, with one being more of a productive and one being more of a counterproductive experience of stress. The experience of stressful events will result in a stress response. And the stress response, if the event is stressful, could be eustress or distress. And eustress is the more productive type of stress, whereas distress is the counterproductive of distress. The eustress is kind of like propelling you forward stress, and distress is kind of like you get stuck in some way. And the key stress response that you might have when you're feeling stress is the term we all know, fight or flight. And this honestly applies to any type of stress. Psychologists have been talking about this for a long time. We talk about it in the workplace, but we also talk about it in any type of psychology. You might have heard therapists and counselors discuss this, that stress response is a cycle that occurs as a form of kind of survival. We have developed this in our history as human beings, just to be able to survive. And the most traditional, thought of stress and the fight or flight response comes from immediate danger. And if you're in danger, you either need to run or you need to fight to survive. So we actually can apply this to modern problems as well that you might think don't really apply to, but stress is stress. And whatever situation you're in that is making you experience stress, you're going to have the same response as you would if you were, a person from, before we had civilizations that are the way that they are now, living in rural, whatever, caveman-esque, if you will, type times. It was maybe a bear or a lion is chasing you, for lack of a better, example, but that's where it comes from, right? We need that response in order to survive that situation. But whatever the stressful situation is, even in the modern day where it's not necessarily a lion chasing you, the stress response and cycle is the same. Of course, we also want to address the fact that more recently psychologists have added a third response besides just fight or flight, and that is freeze. That sometimes to kind of freeze up is the response that we choose, whether willingly or unwillingly. Usually this is a subconscious response. So we do what we have to survive. And sometimes, in some cases, and for some people, that involves becoming more of a fighter and aggressive, running away from the problem, avoidance, flight, or freezing up and kind of just getting stuck. We also distinguish between challenge and hindrance stressors. And these kind of go back to that eustress versus distress idea, but it's more of a perspective thing. So you as a person can evaluate a stressor as either challenge or hindrance. And what these mean is that challenge stressor would be something that when it happens, you take it kind of as a challenge and you experience kind of almost a call to action. So you, instead of being distressed and stuck or it's counterproductive, you find it as like, okay, I can rise to this challenge and I can achieve something to get beyond the stress. So challenge stressors are actually good and they can actually promote productivity and growth and all of these things because we see it as something to be overcome and usually are able to do so. Where the hindrance stressor is when we evaluate the stressor and we realize that it's something that's only going to cause us difficulty and problems, and maybe even we can't overcome this. And those are the ones that are more counterproductive and can result in kind of you freezing up or just getting stuck or being in an endless cycle or things just spiral. Okay. So those are different types of stress and basic stress responses. In addition, we also have this term general adaptation syndrome, which is a nearly universal stress response process. The first part is an alarm reaction where your hormones are released. So it's very physiological there, where you have just kind of whatever stressor you've evaluated, your brain releases usually the hormone cortisol. I'm writing that in. It's kind of known as the stress hormone. And then you go into a coping mechanism, of which there are many. So you try to resist stress. You figure out a coping mechanism, which could be your fight or flight or freeze response, but there's a number of different coping mechanisms. However, those require some level of energy. They also require you to be at a heightened attention. So they eventually lead to exhaustion. And so you cannot be in a stress state forever. You have to complete the stress cycle, the stress response cycle. And that's actually important to know, just as an aside, for any type of stress you are experiencing in your life. A lot of us, we kind of grow into this culture that wants us to not address things that are upsetting and stressful to us in a healthy way. but you have to face them. Sometimes we like to hide from them, as because if you don't, you get stuck in here in this resistance area, and it's exhausting. So you have to complete the cycle to be able to move forward from stress. And there's a number of different ways you can choose to cope and complete the cycle. And of course, that gets into some more clinical or counseling psychology. If you want to know more about that, I might not be the person, though I have some experience, but we're applying this to work here. So, we just are going to broadly kind of go over this. But the main ways that we talk about in IO psychology, at least, of coping are kind of two major groups. They're not one single way, they're just broader categories of coping that you can take when you're dealing with a stressor. And one of them is problem-focused coping, and the other is emotion-focused coping. You might notice some trends here of how this might relate to other constructs we talked about. Problem-focused coping, as the name suggests, is when you choose to address the issue, the cause of the stress. So if something at work is stressing you out, such as a task that you have to get done or a coworker, it's when you go to that task or you go into that coworker and you find out, like, what can you do about that problem, that cause of stress, to address it, whether it's getting it done or breaking it down into parts, etc. The second type is focused coping, where you kind of look more inward and how can you manage and process the emotion and the stress response in order to handle it better. And that will occur, maybe because some people are just more prone to taking that type of coping versus problem focused. However, a lot of it has to do with what the problem is. So you're going to switch between a problem focus and an emotion focus depending on whether or not you think one is going to be more beneficial in dealing with the stress. And sometimes that's because you're just better at one, sometimes it's because you prefer one, but a lot of times it's more about what is the problem. If you can't actually use problem-focused coping, then you will use emotion coping. And within these two major areas of coping, of course, there are both productive and counterproductive forms of coping. If you're choosing emotion-focused coping, maybe talking through managing expectations and things like that is a more productive way, whereas, punching a hole in the wall because you're angry is probably a little less productive. And with problem-focused coping, it's the same. There's, of course, depending on what the problem is, always ways to approach it that are more or less productive. So stressors, so we're going to get to where we're just distinguishing between stressor, stress, and strain, right? So a stressor is the actual physical or psychological demands that you are responding to. It is the event or the issue that you are dealing with that will cause you to feel stress. Anything that causes a stress response. And strain is the reaction to the stress or the stressor. So it's like muscle tension, disengagement, exhaustion, burnout, turnover, when we're talking about workplace. But it can be very, physical things. Think of stress, psychological, in the same way you would think of as a muscle. When you're working a muscle really hard, the stressor might be, I have to push or carry these big heavy boxes as I'm moving, right? So that's the stressor. The stress on my body is how much I feel it, depending on maybe how weak or strong I am, or how heavy the boxes are. And the strain is, at the end of it, how tired my muscles feel. The same thing applies to psychological stressors and workplace stressors. And stress, as I was kind of giving in my definition there of my example, or sometimes in psychology, we refer to it pretty much exclusively as perceived stress, because like many psychological constructs, it's about the perception more than anything else. It is your evaluation of the stressor. So it actually goes like this, where you have a stressor first, one, and then you perceive the stressor, you evaluate, and you come up with how much you perceive it to be actually stressful. And of course, there's so many factors that can contribute to this relationship here, because maybe some people have some factor that makes the stressor not seem like perceived stress. For example, with my moving example, A stronger person might not perceive it as stressful to move a certain box. But there's also other factors, you know, what's your situation? How tired are you from the day before? How much help do you have? Do you have a dolly to help you move things? All of these factors are going to influence whether or not the stressor causes you to perceive a high level of stress. And the more stress you perceive, of course, the more strain you're going to feel. That makes sense, I hope. Yeah, so that is the main distinguishing factors of these that I want you guys to know, and the main intro to what stress and stressors are and strain. And I will get into the next section of the stress lecture in the next video. All right.